I had the pleasure of actually being in Hong Kong 6 years ago for the first Digital Heritage Conference. And at that time, I spoke about searching for a unicorn. And what I'm going to speak about today is searching for maybe something equally chimerical in our globalized world, which is constructive, creative, collective memory. As was said, I am the president of a scientific committee of ICOMOS. And so that really sort of makes me part of a, well, if not a sister discipline, at least a cousin discipline, and I hope it's a friendly cousin to the museum world, because I deal in cultural heritage out in the streets, in the landscapes, across the world, in terms of a way that makes the audience also the creator, and doesn't have so much of a distinction between everyday life and art. In fact, in cultural heritage, everyday life in every period is the art, and it has some different problems. And what I want to speak about today is as that observing cousin, where digital heritage, digital museums have come, and where I think that they might profitably go. What I'm going to argue is really very much as was just argued here, that just as the museum is more than the building, cultural heritage is more than the monument. It is really a social network. That is to say, the qualities, the ideas of authenticity, the connections between one monument and another, one period and another, are actually a symbolic ideogram for how people relate to each other in the present. And more in the heritage field, we have recognized that the past is a part of the present, and that whether we're talking about archaeological sites, or whether we're talking about historic urban landscapes, or for that matter, natural landscapes, we need to start to rethink the relationship between what was always taken for granted as almost a fact of nature, the self-evident value of cultural heritage, and how much is really ascribed to it, and in fact, socially constructed. So I put this slide here, which really shows two different things going on. My committee in ICOMOS, which is the International Council on Monuments and Sites, an advisory body to UNESCO and its World Heritage Program, is called the Committee on Interpretation and Presentation. And for many people, whether that's in the museum world or even in the cultural heritage world, those words are often interchangeable, much like popularization or dissemination or outreach or any of the terms that generally refer to cultural communication with the general public. But we made a big distinction when the committee was formed and went on to create an international charter on interpretation and presentation, with the idea that presentation means basically a carefully ordered grouping of information that is transmitted from an expert source, whether that's a scholar or even a guide, to a public that is seen as sort of an empty vessel. And it's all a matter of communications theory. How accurately does the guide or the sign or the interactive application convey information about the site, with the assumption that the primary value that has been chosen by the composer of the presentation is the correct one? We went to the word interpretation Because in the cultural encounter, whether it's in a museum or an archaeological site, interpretation goes on. It goes on by those visitors, that part of the public, that tries to figure out what the presentation is trying to say. And the two of them together, the expert source trying to figure out what the significance is, and the general public trying to figure out what relevance it has to his or her life, is all a very complex contemporary interaction that in fact produces a new reality, that in fact produces more than was there with the presentation alone. Now, I was very struck in the discussions yesterday about the idea that these three words were central to understanding what is at the base of that cultural communication. And although it was really in connection with museums and archives, I can just as easily transform it, and I will in the coming few moments, transform it into the problems that we face in cultural heritage. So there is the resource, whether that is a collection of documents or artworks or archaeological sites or cultural landscapes, that is the resource. But the identification of that resource is not static. It changes all the time. And we'll talk about why it changes. So historiography, it's the changing tale of the past. And often it refers more directly to the last teller of the tale than the past itself. The paradigm is something that's really interesting to us, and maybe I misinterpret it, but I'll creatively misinterpret it, as what the behavior is. What is the action? When someone goes to a museum, that's a certain action. And as I will explain in cultural heritage, there has been a transformation of what the contemporary action is. And finally, it requires no further explanation, is the technology that we all know is constantly changing, and in this digital age is changing quite fast. So I want to say, before we start to examine the mutations of those four elements, that heritage is not only about the past, it's also about the future. Heritage are the way that we shape the world to maintain some continuity with the past, but also to aim toward a certain future. Even in the classical days of cultural heritage, when there was a really aesthetic sense of preserving only the extraordinary, what was termed the extraordinary was aimed at enshrining a certain elite to continue to have its power. So whether it is the city of Sana'a in Yemen, with the very traditional multi-story mud buildings, anyone who knows this culture, it's very distinctive. But if you look closely, you can see the satellite discs on the roofs of those very classical buildings, with a cultural landscape that points both backwards and forwards. And basically, what I'm trying to say is that the world is the museum of cultural heritage, and it is the water we swim in, the ice we skate on, and the historical landscape with its mix of past and future that allows us not only to know where we are in time, but in many important dimensions, enables us to know who we are. So I wanted to say that cultural heritage, which maybe people have this idea of very, very elite Western connoisseurs of great architecture and cathedrals, UNESCO picking only the finest examples of every kind of architecture and archaeological site for the World Heritage List, is undergoing some very deep soul searching right now. The very basis of cultural heritage, as we know it, is now under reconsideration. In fact, with the breakdown, it has been referred to a number of times, both in the talk yesterday about intangible cultural heritage and today, the idea of a hierarchy of taste is really sort of gone out the window. And the idea of a more anthropologically oriented idea of the value of both the vernacular, the everyday, the globalized, and the spectacular are all seen as equally valid, which brings us to the really serious question. We can't preserve everything of everything, so what really should be considered heritage? Now, this is tied to another contemporary concern. What is the social function of cultural heritage? Now, when all of us who are in cultural heritage are asked, what is the social function, or more usually, what is the value of cultural heritage, we are fabulous in spouting cliches. There are cliches all the time about the past being the basis for the future, the idea that without roots, society can go on and on with the cliches. But we really don't understand, to the depth that we understand other cultural phenomena, why this attachment to old things, and why do different groups of people get attached to different things? Which brings up another issue and another cliche. It's often said, especially when people are trying to go and get funding from international development agencies and government, they say that cultural heritage is the key to identity. Well, what is this thing, identity? What does that mean? We'll talk about that briefly. And so we have, out of this whole, basically the material culture of the world, the real practical question of what is it that we should document and what should we protect? We heard yesterday about the intangible cultural heritage of Hong Kong. And of course, the convention has certain very specific categories of intangible heritage. But here too, if one wanted to really document and protect the whole range of intangible heritage, where would you stop? And most important of all, especially for my theme today of heritage as a social network, who is entitled to decide how we shape our futures? What we save, what we commemorate, and what we allow the bulldozer to take away. Now, as I said, the traditional presentation of cultural heritage was always seen as authoritative. That is to say, it was seen almost as a fact of nature, like geology, that the history that you learned, those dates that you were supposed to memorize in school, were unambiguously important. And that's how it was taught. From the time of Christian Thompson at the Danish National Museum, when he invented this idea of the stone, the bronze, and the Iron Age, and is lecturing here to people, or 1950s American school children during the Cold War who learned the steps that were important of American history, from the Pilgrims to the Revolutionary War to the Civil War and so forth, with this idea of conquering the wilderness. But both of those have a subtext, that kind of historiography, and that historiography in traditional heritage practices also determined what the resources were. The paradigm was listening carefully and quietly and trying to soak it all in. And the technology didn't move a whole lot from the traditional early museums with objects in sequences, be they aesthetic style development or historical events. Maybe it went a little bit out of the museum with historical signposts like you see on the right. Because this was all part of a social technology, of the idea of the nation state. Starting in northwestern Europe, certainly moving to the United States, but the idea was to create something new. Instead of traditional regional cultures, nation states were invented. And these were blocks of territory that were homogeneous in many ways, or at least ideologically homogeneous. They had very defined boundaries. They were largely of a homogeneous ethnic makeup. They spoke the same language. They shared the same national character, national cuisine, and national costume. And what happened was that in basically directing all people from their regional cultures and so forth to the nation, a kind of new collective memory, far apart from the family, far apart from the kinship, even eventually far apart from many of the religious bonds that tied people together. It created a new culture. Now, what changed and what is relevant for this story was the idea that monuments could become sort of symbolic, well, ideographs for the story of the nation. And the inventor of cultural heritage, as we know it in antiquity services all over the world, was Eugène Viollet-le-Duc in France, who at the post-revolutionary era sort of invented France, invented an idea of a medieval France that was composed of everything from the Roman period to the great chateau of the Loire, by making them each one a sort of a moving pageant, a symbol of a stage in the nation's history, really stripped down, really very much elaborated and essentialized. Here you have his reconstruction of what the Louvre looked like, but his most famous achievement was the city of Carcassonne in southwest France, which is a virtual 19th century Disneyland of 19th century ideas of what chivalry and knights and the Gothic revival was all about. So what Viollet-le-Duc and all that followed him did was not so much change the historiography of the nation, but they changed the resources to material resources, and they changed the paradigm to become one of visiting, almost making a pilgrimage to the sites of national importance. Now, I have to say that the technology did change in the nationalistic era, and in a strange, almost precocious, early analog immersive heritage circle, there was the phenomenon of the cyclorama or the panorama, in which stirring scenes from a nation's history, in this case the Battle of Gettysburg, but they're all over the world, from Waterloo in Belgium to Moscow. And this was a new technology that allowed people the impression of stepping into their nation's history with these very elaborately painted 360-degree panoramas of battles. Often there would be a band playing, there would be sound effects. It was really a pre-electric kind of virtual reality. There was also another thing that came up, especially as people had more time in the industrial era to spend with their families, family fun time, as it was called yesterday. This is a scene from the 1893 Chicago's World Fair. And the idea was that one could be exposed to the wonders of the world safely by seeing these different tableaux. And this, as you can read, was a tableau of an opium smoker's den at the Chicago World's Fair. And there were, of course, all kinds from African villages to South Sea Islanders to a full-scale reconstruction of Jerusalem. But here, too, the paradigm was more and more shifting from a patriotic pilgrimage to an escape from everyday life to a more authentic, a more exotic realm. And this became especially true as the Industrial Revolution and industrialization and urbanization moved on. And here you have a poster for Bruges in 1904, which says Bruges, la vie musée, the museum city. In fact, the idea came about that the past was somehow more authentic than the present. Its values were sounder, its art was more beautiful, its atmosphere more soothing and spiritual. And so you see the middle-class lady looking at a reliquary from the Middle Ages. And with that came the real beginning of I would say more than the marriage of tourism and cultural heritage, the lingering passionate love affair between tourism and cultural heritage, especially with the invention of the automobile. Now, people with automobiles had the possibility to visit all kinds of things, even this strange thing. I don't know what the source of this was, but obviously people wanted to get to that obelisk in some way, so they have the cage around it, but the people were certainly visiting. And the growth of highways, the expansion of tourist attractions, of cultural heritage as a tourist attraction, became stronger and stronger. Until we get to today, leaving out a lot of the story, but I only have 50 minutes or so, where the past has become a theme park. The past has become an entertainment venue. The past has become a place where one's fantasies of authenticity can virtually be fulfilled. Here you can see on the highway in France that a voyage through time is at the next rest stop. Now, there are certain characteristics that have come to be in the last 20 or so years, especially with sites that have pretensions to gain major visitation, like World Heritage sites and so forth. They all share the necessity of elaborate physical design. Now, the elaborate physical design has been adapted in many ways from the design of theme parks. First, the World's Fairs that we saw, but then really the ancestor, if I could say, of World Heritage sites throughout the UNESCO system, which is that 1955 creation called Disneyland. Now, people often say, oh, I don't want it to be like Disneyland when we're talking about developing cultural heritage sites. But Disneyland was a place that was done with such care and careful planning that the UNESCO experts and cultural heritage designers can only aspire to the kind of pleasurable experience that Disney provides. And in fact, what comes out of this physical design is the possibility of a revenue-generating machine that governments are ready not only to spend their own money, but take enormous loans from the World Bank to fund, with the idea, very, very very flimsy idea that if you build it, they will come. There is an industry that has grown of designers and park planners and cultural heritage managers that are very anxious to sell governments all over the world on the idea that their cultural heritage, far from being a resource that should be conserved, is a resource like bauxite, like gold, like aluminum, that should be consumed as fast as possible for as much short-time gain as possible. And what's so interesting about this is the shift in all kinds of things, in the paradigm, in the historiography, even in the resources. Because I would argue, and I have argued, that there is a story that all modern cultural heritage sites share. And it is a story that's read with the feet, not with the mind or the eyes or with a book, but it's read with the feet. And whether it is, as I show here, the concentration camp at Auschwitz, or whether it is Knossos in Greece, or whether it is Versailles, that story read with the feet is really all the same. It's from the car park to the ticket booth, through a carefully demarcated route of interpretation in which there are increasingly large number of digital technologies and multimedia to add that edutainment aspect, and it ends out to the gift shop and back to the car park again. And as a result, it really doesn't matter on many levels if it's Auschwitz or Versailles, because what people remember about cultural heritage site visits is the visit itself. Whether little Johnny bought the toy he wanted, whether your daughter was sick, whether your feet were aching, people remember the visit itself. And all I can say is this where collective memory has gotten to in our globalized world? That cultural heritage that has so much potential, if people would act upon it, choose it actively, choose their identities, be involved in how their historical landscape is shaped, has become really passive kind of entertainment. And what I want to say, as gently as I can, of course, because I respect everything that's being done from the standpoint of digital heritage, I'm not sure if we're not improving the technology without changing either the resources, the historiography, or the paradigm. We're making that kind of one-way communication ever more precise, ever more eye-popping, ever more attractive to visitors, but to what end? And I want to suggest that maybe an answer for digital heritage, along with all the important work that is being done, that I absolutely do not contest, is maybe we should think beyond visualization for a while and go back to the community. Go back to the community as a memory community rather than as an audience or a potential client. Throughout the world, the drop in budgets in our neoliberal world of governments all over the world have had a huge impact on the services that can be provided, and none more than the cultural sector. So it's understandable why cultural institutions, cultural sectors like cultural heritage, need to either reach out to communities to help, or reach out to private industry to generate the revenue that once was provided for other uses. And it's very interesting to look at this old. This is by Sherry Arnstein back in the 1960s when people thought the world could be changed, and it's about the ladder of public engagement. Now, we all talk about engaging publics, all of us, cultural heritage or not, but it's very interesting to look back on these stages, and you can all decide where you are. I can tell you that in cultural heritage, I can tell you where we are. Sometimes we're in manipulation. Sometimes it's just trying to get people into the park by whatever, by having fireworks on Friday nights or whatever. Sometimes it's therapy, the second step of engagement, which is the poor, benighted masses need a little bit of help with cultural heritage. Then there's the tokenism. That is that we inform them what's going on. We consult with them with no obligation to take their consultation as anything other than an exercise in sort of token connection. And then there's placation, when a very loud or a well politically connected group objects to the development of a heritage site, we can placate them by saying, okay, we'll move. We won't build it here. You know. Now, the top rungs of the ladder are the difficult ones. They're difficult structurally because our cultural heritage laws are all built to continue this idea of presentation from the top down, that the scholars, that the heritage administrators, that the educators, and even the site interpreters know best, and that they select the things of significance and dish them out. So citizen power, this idea of partnership, makes people, certainly in my organization, Ecomos, very, very nervous. You know, how can we've spent all these years in school. How can we let Joe the plumber tell us what's important? And even worse is the delegated power. My God, just that you know, if you let a community decide their own heritage values, God knows what they will come up with. And finally, worst of all, is citizen control, democracy. Well, I want to explain why I came up with this idea of why I think that the idea of social networks is an important one that needs to be even further developed. We have a huge industry that has grown up in America, partially because of the McDonaldization of the world, the strip mallization of the world, that kind of thing, that cultural landscapes are becoming ever more uniform. Non-places, as the French postmodernists would say. I mean, would we know, except maybe for the characters on the exit sign where we are right now? Well, people are hungry for identity. And they're even ready to buy identity at a place. And so there is this very successful concern called Ancestry.com in the United States that basically has transformed digitized archives into something that can be sold for profit. That with a subscription every month, someone can join Ancestry.com and take advantage with a very user-friendly interface and build a genealogy. Now, genealogies are okay for royalty and if you're in line to inherit a lot of money or so forth. But as collective memory, they're sort of junk food. The idea that you can trace your ancestry back to Henry VIII or something, leaves out all the 99.999% of losers that are in your family tree. So we need to go somewhere beyond this kind of self-commemoration, individual commemoration. And that's why I want to turn to the social media landscape. Now, I've got a Facebook page, I'll admit it. This is something that is transforming the way that people communicate and the way that society itself understands how communication works. The study of social networks, social network analysis, has shown some amazing things, even beyond 6 degrees of separation, and the idea of the Kevin Bacon game, if people know that the whole world is connected within just a very few steps. You know someone who knows someone, so forth. So what I'm suggesting is that social media, of paying more attention to who is authentic rather than what is authentic, is the way that digital heritage can help restore genuine collective memory in our globalized world. And there are already a number of very interesting experiments that await more sophisticated technological architecture. Here's Survey LA, which is sponsored by the Getty Conservation Institute, a very straight-laced physical conservation organization in the United States, in which they have funded a project with the Office of Historic Resources of the City of Los Angeles, in which instead of the top-down way of taking an inventory of Los Angeles's cultural resources, according to the very strict criteria of the National Register of Historic Places, which privileges the elite, the unusual, the symbolic, and so forth. This is just asking people to identify their own historic LA. And instead of it being the first or the grandest, it might have been the McDonald's parking lot where one found his or first love. I mean, who knows? It's a really interesting, exciting project in which the collective memory of the people of Los Angeles, or at least those who were encouraged to participate in this inventory, are helping to shape that historic landscape to accord more with their own feelings than what they were taught in school. Likewise, my colleague Angela Labrador from the University of Massachusetts and now Coherent Associates did a really interesting project about the preservation of rural land, in which people from the community were basically asked how they envision all these iconic ideas that we take for granted about agricultural land, about how the rural is somehow more bucolic and down to earth than the urban. There are many projects underway, fascinating projects with digital diasporas, because in our multicultural world, with populations moving, the old bases of cultural heritage have completely been smashed. That old idea of a coherent country with a majority culture, a majority language, and a majority cuisine has been smashed by massive transfers of population everywhere, whether it is Hong Kong or Brussels or Mumbai or New York. It's all mixed up. And the problem of heritage of the diaspora that was just mentioned is a really serious one, because those who are in a diaspora are in a sort of liminal state. They're not entirely 100% usually in the culture of their adopted country, and as the years go by, they get farther and farther away from the culture of their homeland. So there's a natural tendency, at least when it comes to cultural heritage, that when diasporic people come back to their homeland, they're disappointed. They're frustrated. It's not homelandy enough. It isn't as they remembered it. And so you find this strange phenomenon all over the world of wealthy, successful, diasporic people coming in and funding cultural heritage sites in their adopted home, trying to turn back the clock and not allow those people to move on. Also, there's a question of what gets saved. And usually that's somewhere in the Ministry of Culture, Ministry of Public Works and Planning and so forth. But with social networking, here's a very interesting initiative to support the maintenance of Greek cultural heritage against the budget cuts of the IMF. And the slogan is fabulous. The monuments have no voice, they must have yours. And here we get basically to really realizing the idea that people are speaking through the monuments. And we have for too long let a small group speak for the monuments and pretend they're not ventriloquists. It's like in the Wizard of Oz. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. We have seen cultural heritage as a fact of nature when it really was a ventriloquist dummy. Also, a really interesting, I wouldn't say crowdsourcing technology, is but it's certainly a collaborative idea. It's sponsored by Ancestry.com is a good corporate citizen, but with the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, in which basically there are all these digitized documents, and they're asking people to get involved and help trace, help write the history. And here's a case where people who are connected through the social network actually contribute to the changing historiography. So I want to conclude with a couple of diagrams, which I hope won't be too boring, because as I said, social networks have really been used by private concerns, corporations, and so forth, understanding how networks work to try to get the word out about new projects and so forth. And there are two different approaches. That is the supply side, so beloved of job creators and Republicans and neoliberals everywhere, where the idea is that you want to stimulate people to buy. So you see at the top here, there is the manufacturer who basically targets through resellers and so forth. But there is the pull strategy, in which consumers make their wishes known to those middle people, and the manufacturer then comes across. Now you can transfer this very easily to the field of cultural heritage by reversing the social network. We've heard a lot about how the museum is interconnected. There are all these connections through space and time, and it attracts people to come who have special connections to those exhibits, the themes, and so forth. But if you reverse it completely and put people at the core and cultural heritage outside, then you've got a completely different orientation of cultural heritage and a completely different orientation of push and pull. Where at the top, where you have a cultural heritage site or a memory institution such as an archive or a museum, basically branding itself to what they have in their mind as pre-existing individual profiles. So they will create the digital platform that will filter out, according to the profiles, that which will attract certain groups of consumers. And so that's really a push. But you could reverse it entirely with the pull of a social network, where the bearers of memory and tradition, or the seekers of identity, can access a database or a user interface and in fact make it clear what they are interested in, whether that is part of the research, part of the things that they want to find out about the past, part of the issues of what places they would like to preserve. And that gets to the authority. It is bottom up. It gets to the authority. And the pull is recognizing not that the museum or the cultural heritage site is a super groovy, fun place to take your family on the weekend, but that it could be a platform for the exercise of their own identity and collective memory. So what I would say, in my own advice and from my own perspective in cultural heritage, is that the real potential of digital heritage is not just about ever more accurate, more vivid documentation of a static past in some way. Although it's important, and I'm not saying that branch shouldn't be continued. But it has to deal with process rather than product. In technology and the internet and digital tools facilitating that kind of evolving collective memory and helping to rebuild the empowerment of people to do what has always been done, to make their own past. So I would conclude by saying there's a lot to do, and that the frontiers of digital heritage are everywhere. Thank you. Is there any time, or maybe there's not?
Yeah, thank you, Neil. That was really fascinating, very thought-provoking. Questions for Neil, Len?
Yeah, I thank you for a really informative and provocative talk. Terrific to have here. When you talk about the social networking, among the aspects of social networking that I think are important are that it creates spheres of like-mindedness, spheres of interest, spheres of persuasion in the broader sense of social networking.
Mm-hmm.
And I was also taken by your depiction of what becomes important about visiting a site. It's that moment of the child who is laughing or whatever. So I'd like you to address, if you could, how this connects to what we know about the sociology of memory, the neurology of memory. I tend to think of interpretation, if I had to boil it down to three things, very clearly, very simplified, is what should somebody know, what should somebody feel, and what are the expectations of what they should do?
Mm-hmm.
So I would like to, so if you could just respond to that a little bit, I'd be great.
Well, I say this all the time, so anybody who knows me is going to be bored, so you don't have to listen. There is a psychiatric syndrome that has been recently uncovered called confabulation syndrome. And with so many people living to advanced ages, there is really this problem of memory, and it really has been boiled down to the inability of the frontal lobes of an individual to judge whether an impression is worth paying attention to and worth believing. So there are typical examples of a doctor who will go into a patient in a hospital room. And the patient with confabulation syndrome will have an extremely detailed version of what he did last weekend, going to the city and where he ate for dinner and what play he saw and what hotel and what the hotel room was like, with enormous detail. But the doctor knows that person has been in the hotel room all weekend. It's sort of like anything that comes to mind. Those of us in this room, I hope most of us have working frontal lobes. When you say to people, who here has been to the North Pole? And unless there are explorers here, no one has been, and no one will raise their hand. But In the millisecond that I said that, everyone had their own little visions of the North Pole. A striped pole, maybe Santa Claus, who knows? But because you have working frontal lobes, he said, that's just images. I've not been to the... Now, with this kind of super souped up cultural heritage that becomes an entertainment value rather than a memory, we have collective confabulation syndrome. We can know lots and lots of factoids about every kind of history, archaeological thing, and so forth, but they have virtually no social significance, virtually none. So the idea is to change the focus to reconstruct, to teach children that instead of staying behind the velvet rope in the house museum and being quiet for the teacher, they should recognize that their own lives possess cultural heritage. The fabulous project, school project done by the Council of Europe called Europe from One Street to the Other. And it was specifically aimed at the phenomenon of there are so many children of immigrant parents in European cities. And the last thing that they're interested in the medieval stuff, if they're from Senegal or whatever, it has nothing to do with them. This was a program that was sort of a workbook. And it asked the children to say, okay, draw a map of the street that you live on. And can you mark where any important things happened on that street that you can remember? Can you say which is the most beautiful building? Can you say who is the meanest person on that street? And it's beginning to build those muscles of recognizing that we are part of the past. It's not apart from us and so forth. Now, when you asked about neuroscience and so forth, neuroscience is seeing more and more that there is a tremendous interlock between collective memory and individual memory. And it's not quite clear where the boundaries are or which influences which. Now, when we see in our world all kinds of news that whizzes by us, like the stock exchange prices at the bottom of the screen, like once they're gone, they're forgotten, we have really lost the ability to know who we are and where we are, and we tend to take very borrowed themes that are often put there because the focus groups show that the most visitors will go to those sites. So I would say that for the biological, neuroscientific idea that the visualization of the past is very similar to the visualization of the future. They're very comparable. That we need to regain a collective memory that we can learn from, that we can, in fact, act more intelligently, more creatively, and maintain a sort of sustainable culture today. So that's what I would say about that.
All right, thank you very much, Neil.
Okay.
Appreciate it. Thank you.